Okay, hi everyone. How are you? So I think this is my second time talking at Washington County. Can I see a show of hands? This is just the thought that occurred to me when I walked in today. How many people here have gone to the Humphrey School? Some hands there. When I walked in this building, I was like, this is like the Humphrey School, only supersized. It looks like it. That is not why I'm here to talk to you today. My name is Susan Brower. I'm the state demographer, and I'll be talking about the demographics of our state, and more particularly Washington County, what's been happening in recent years, what I expect to happen in the coming years, and then we also have a little bit about the census that I want to talk about, because the census is coming up and we all have a role to play in its success. You don't get me without a census commercial, so bear with me. Okay, so here's what's happening in terms of growth in Washington County. Washington County has now topped 250,000 people, and what I want you to notice from this graph, if we look way back to 1950 when the county was just starting to grow, you can see that there's the spurt of growth during the 1990s where that kind of picks up, the pace of growth picks up, and it's tapered off a little bit now. So you're still growing at a good clip, but it isn't as strong as it was in the 1990s. It's tapered a bit. And if we look just at how population change, that pace has changed, if we look at a yearly average, you can see that it's slowed down a bit since 1990. It's even slowed down since the 2000s. This is pretty common for the suburban type county that Washington County is. We've seen tapered growth, and we're projecting it for the state overall as we age. As the county ages, as the state ages, it's just not as easy to grow as it was when we were a younger state. People don't always think about growth as being kind of a youth phenomenon, but it is. It's really hard to have children in your 60s and your 70s. It can happen sometimes, but for the most part, this is something that happens when you're 20, when you're 30 years old, and when people move into a new location, into a new county, into a new city, they're often in their 20s, often in their 30s. Of course it happens when you're in your 40s and your 50s that you move around as well, but it's largely youth that are mobile. And so we're seeing a lot of this kind of tapered growth since the recession, but it's also kind of underlying the economic drivers of slower growth is also just the impact of aging, the impact of the fact that we have older residents. So this isn't particularly surprising, but it is what it is. We do expect kind of tapered growth in the future for Washington County, for the state overall. And if we look at this in terms of percentage terms, we see much the same pattern, that there's been this drop off just in growth. 1.1% is still quite strong growth for an annual average. So it's not something to be concerned about from a growth perspective, but it's just not quite what you experience, say, in the 1990s, where you were close to 4% growth. So I want to talk about how this fits with the bigger picture of what's happening in Minnesota, because I think that gives us a little bit of a sense of what we can expect for Washington County in the coming years in terms of population growth, what we might expect. The state has been growing modestly since the last census, since 2010. The very darkest areas that you see up here are the areas that have grown the fastest in numeric terms. So we were just looking at these numbers a different way, but just to give you a sense of the concentration of these numbers in the Twin Cities in particular, there is growth that's happening up near the Fargo-Moorhead area. You can see that Clay County is that dark blue. Around Rochester, the Olmsted area is dark blue. But by and large, where most of the growth is happening is in the Twin Cities metropolitan area, the 7-county area, and up along that I-94 corridor. This is showing you the first half of the decade. The second half showed a similar pattern. What has changed in the last 15 to 16 or so years has been that we have seen a tremendous drop-off in the exurban growth. So the counties that are considered exurban counties for the purposes of this graph and some of the stuff that we look at are Carver, Chisago, Asante, Scott, and Wright counties. And you can see, in the early 2000s, before the housing boom and bust, before the Great Recession, those counties were growing some of the fastest rates in the whole nation. So if you looked at the whole U.S., these counties stood out as the fastest growing counties. And you can see that since that time, over the course of the recession and the housing crisis, those growth rates have really dropped off. And we've seen an uptick in growth in the urban areas, in the urban counties in particular, Hennepin and Ramsey County. We've seen steady growth in the suburban counties as well. It's kind of remained in that 1% growth range. But I think the biggest story here in terms of our growth as a state is that there's really been a drop-off in those exurban areas, and now those areas are growing close to the same rate as the urban counties of Hennepin and Ramsey. And just to give you a sense of what that looks like county by county, you can see in the green bars are showing you the number of people that have been added since 2010, and the dots are showing you the growth rate. Hennepin and Ramsey County have added in numeric terms the most, but we're seeing, decent growth among the other 5 counties as well. I just wanted to show Washington County, how you compare to the other suburban counties. I think of these as your peer counties because they have been, the housing stock has been built up. Much of the land is used up, but not all of the land is used in terms of what can be developed. So I think of these 3 kind of as the peers in terms of population growth, and you're really along that same trajectory where you've seen rapid growth in the 1990s, and again, it's tapered again. In part, it has to do with the recession, but the other piece of it is a longer-term trend of aging that underlies that. And just to kind of drive home what a different pattern we're seeing around the state in the last 7 years than in the last time period before that, looking at the 1990s or the 2000s, you can see that in addition to just the growth being concentrated in the urban counties, it's also concentrated in the urban cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, the center cities. So just to give you a point of reference, Minneapolis during the last census between 2000 and 2010, right around the time of the last census, around 2010, they worked really, really hard on getting a good census count. They actually won an award for census participation for the size of the city that they were, because they got so much neighborhood involvement, so many people focused on taking a good and complete and accurate census. So they get their census number in the mail, they rip open the envelope, I don't know, they probably just downloaded it from a website, but let's pretend like they got a letter and they ripped it open and they wanted to see how well they did with their census count, and they had lost 40 people over the course of the decade. So 2000 to 2010, lost 40 people. St. Paul actually lost more than that over that same time period. And now in the last 7 years, you can see that we have 60,000 added to Minneapolis and St. Paul. So it's a big turnaround. Some of the graphs make it look like, oh, there's a little shift, a gentle little shift. But if you think about what a difference that is, where there's almost no growth in these cities, and then in the center cities, there's kind of an explosion. This isn't only happening in the Twin Cities, in the center cities in Minnesota. This is something that's happening across the U.S., where we have a tremendous amount of growth in the center cities that haven't had this level of growth in the past. Why am I talking so much about the center cities? I'm getting to why it impacts Washington County. Just wait for it. So if you look at the numbers, if you look at what's driving the growth in these areas, this is just one example of how people move, how people migrate. And what this graph is telling you with the blue line is Ramsey County. It's telling you that people in their 20s tend to move into Ramsey County, and then when they get older, they move out of Ramsey County. That's what that bump up is in the 20s. And you can see that Washington County is just the opposite. In their 20s, people tend to move out. Maybe they're going to college, and they tend to move back afterwards. So you can see that there's been this tremendous amount of growth in Minneapolis and St. Paul. If you look at the number, at the people who moved in the last 5 years, it's 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds. And the question is, will they stay in the center cities, or will they move out to the more suburban counties? Will they move to Woodbury? Will they move to other areas where when they're moving into home ownership, when they're moving into parenthood, those years, just where will they settle? Where will the amenities be that they need? So I see this growth in Minneapolis and St. Paul as having some long-term tails. I think that it's going to have some impact for some time because there's some momentum to growth that happens. But I also think that we're just on the cusp of those same folks who are set to move back out into the surrounding areas. That's already begun to happen in other areas around the U.S. where you've seen a lot of growth right in the center cities, and then that growth has started to dissipate outwards in the last few years. We haven't quite seen that yet here in the Twin Cities, but that's what I would expect to happen next. And that's just because this is a really stable pattern where you see a lot of people moving in. They're moving into areas where they're renting oftentimes. They're moving into areas where it's difficult to get to work without public transit. It's difficult to take children to childcare, take children to work, get back and forth on public transit. When you start moving into those older years, not older, because it's so young compared to me, but when you get into the years where you have young children, where you're a parent, where you're moving into career, when you're moving into home ownership, that's when we start seeing more of that growth. And it's a huge cohort of people in their 20s right now who have recently moved into those center cities, but we expect to start seeing some of that growth outward. So I would expect that to begin impacting Washington County in the coming years in terms of the growth rate. Okay, if you have a demographer to your speaking event, that demographer must talk about population aging. It's like they make us. I don't know who they is, but they make us talk about aging. And I know you all have heard about aging so much that you almost can't even think about it anymore. But it is something that is still very much at the forefront of my mind and very much at the forefront of shaping our public budgets, our public institutions, and our communities in the years to come. So it's something that I want to continue to bring focus to and to just give you a sense of where we're at in that. Oh, I forgot to do my other one. Hang on. There we go, aging. Okay, to give you a sense of what we look like. This is a state number. I'll show you what Washington County looks like in a moment. But we've got this huge generation of baby boomers there in green. I was just talking about the generation, the millennial generation, who are kind of shaping the growth patterns right now regionally. But when I look at this graph, if you think about it like it's an escalator and every 5 years everyone moves up a bar, every 5 years everyone moves up a bar, you start to get the sense for the timing of this aging trend. When we make our projections about how many older adults there will be in the coming years, we're really just aging folks forward. I sometimes give these talks with, similar talks with Laura Kolumbakidis, who's the state economist, and she has such a complicated model to predict a budget, a state's economy 2 years out. That's her job. For me, my job isn't quite that hard with what I need to predict, because we know how many people are living in the state right now. We know how old they are. My predecessor, does anyone remember Tom Gillespie? He always loved to say, we think people age on average 1 year every 12 months. It's a super complicated theory, guys. We build it into this. I'm drawing this all out to say, this aging trend, there's no escaping the aging trend. It's moving forward in a very predictable way. We can see how it's unfolding. We can figure out the timing of it just by looking at this one graph and saying, okay, we got people moving into those older years. This is what Washington County looks like. The most recent Washington County data. Don't pay too much attention to any one bar because it's from a sample, and so it's going to bounce around a little bit. But just take a look at the general shape of Washington County, and I would say it's a relatively older county, much like the state is a relatively older state. So what you should be thinking about when you look at something like this is how long until we have a large proportion of our population moving across major thresholds. And for me, one of the major thresholds is retirement. We look at age 65 as kind of a proxy age for retirement, although when we look at the data, that holds up pretty well too. Of course, not everyone retires when they hit age 55. Some do it sooner, some do it later. But it still stands as a pretty good estimate for that big life transition. And you can see here in Washington County that the largest cohort of people are still in their 50s. So you have some time to go until that transition is full. But I would say that the aging trend is going to have a large impact on Washington County, just looking at the shape of this population pyramid. Many counties that are younger counties that are growing more rapidly, you'll see look like a triangle because they have a lot more younger people. This tells me that, a large proportion of your residents are up there in the older ages, set to move into retirement, and then in the next 15 to 20 years set to move into the ages where they will need more long-term care and health care services. Am I cheering you up? I gave a talk at the U about a month ago, and there was an economist that went after me, and he said, I was always taught that it's economics that is the dismal science. But after talking after Susan, now I'm going to say it's demographics from here on out. So stick with me, though. I think there's plenty of good news in this. Again, I just want to draw attention to the inevitability of the aging trend. We looked at what your age structure in Washington County looks like. We know there's going to be a lot of people aging into their 60s, into the later 60s, into retirement, and then moving on into the older years where more health care, more long-term care services are needed. And you can see, if you just start to think about where we are on this timeline, just how long it takes until we start feeling the increased pressures brought about by an aging population. It's not going to be a tremendous amount of health. There'll be some, but not a tremendous amount of budget pressure at first. as the baby boomers are still relatively young. They're 63, they're going up to the cabin still. They're not all of them will be experiencing healthcare issues and day-to-day kind of independent living issues. But as they get as more of them move into their 80s, as more of that big, huge cohort of people start moving into those older years, that's when we'll start to feel it. And that's really starting, in the mid-2020s up to about 2030. So there'll be increased pressure on budgets, and there'll be increased need for healthcare services and long-term care services over that time period. But we'll really start to feel that crunch just because that's when most of that huge generation will begin to be in their 80s after 2030. One of the impacts of aging, of course, will be on public budgets. And I like to remind people that when there is impact on a public budget, it doesn't only impact the people in that age group. And that's true of the aging trend in particular. So if you've been hearing me talk about aging and the need for long-term care, the need for services, and you think, well, that's okay because I work with children and youth, that's not someone else will take care of that. It's really part of a whole budget package. It's really going to mean increases on the whole budget that impacts everyone from birth to moving on to the great beyond, I guess, is my best metaphor. And one way to think about that is if you look at the state's general fund budget, is what I have here, you can see about 30% goes to health and human services. And as the baby boomers move into those older ages, that's the piece of the pie that's going to have to grow to meet those new demands. That's where the cost will be growing. And the question is, where will that come from? Will that move into other pieces of the pie? Will we have reduced budget available for K-12 education, for higher ed? Or will there'll be more growth overall? Budget growth overall. It's hard for me to imagine that there'll be more economic growth overall, because one of the things that drives economic growth is a rapidly growing workforce, and that's going to be really tough with all the retirements we have coming up. So I set this out here just to say that I think we're moving forward into a time where we will have structural budget issues as the baby boomers move into those older years. It's true at the state level, but it's also probably true at the county level, at the federal level, and it's something that we haven't fully resolved yet. It's particularly around the area of long-term care that we expect these issues to arise. And I think the discussions so far, the public discussions that I have heard, have been, well, we have to just keep those costs low. We have to do everything. And the state really has done a good job of keeping people in their homes just as long as they possibly can, and reducing those costs and keeping people happy because they want to stay in their homes, keeping people independent. But at some point, the size of the wave of aging that's coming will not be enough to be solved by just a few changes on the margins, I don't think. The other issue that the aging of the baby boomers brings that will impact Washington County, and I probably already is, I'll ask you about this in a second, I want to hear about it, is that we expect to have very little growth in the labor force going forward. This is because we have so many older adults who are moving into retirement. We saw that there were a lot of young people, millennials, moving into the workplace, but it's not enough to both make up for the exodus of the baby boomers into retirement and keep the level of growth that we've had in the past. So what this graph is telling you is that in the 1990s, our state's workforce grew by 54,000, on average 54,000 people each year during that decade, Or between 1990 and 2000, we added 540,000 additional workers. And you can see how that's dropped off during the 2000s, during the early 2010s, and for the next 5 years, next 15 to 20 years, we expect to add very, very few additional people to the workforce. So the number of people that we have today in Minnesota who are here and available to work is very close to the number of people who are going to be here and available to work in 15 years, in 20 years. And again, it's just the impact of aging. It's the impact of lower birth rates. This is another thing that's pretty easy to predict, guys. You know, we don't make workers fully formed at age 18. We know who's coming. We know who's coming and who will be kind of in the right age to work decades ahead of time. And so the workers 15 years from now have already been born. We can see how many there are. It's not rocket science. There is some immigration assumptions that go into our projections. And actually, we've made assumptions about immigration that the rates will continue as they have in the last 5 or so years after the recession. Of course, you turn on your TV, you know there's a very different conversation about immigration right now than there was 10 years ago. And if we do a lot of, if there's a huge policy change that restricts immigration to the US, that restricts immigration to Minnesota, we would expect that these numbers would actually go negative. So this is telling us that we're going to grow, just barely, we're just barely going to grow given the immigration assumptions that we're basing off the last 5 or so years. But if we have less immigration than we have had in recent years, we would actually begin to see fewer people in the workforce than we have now. So who in the room does hiring? So there's a handful. Have you noticed, has it been more difficult lately? Yeah. So this is something when I'd talk about it 5 years ago, and I'd say, it's coming, just wait. We're gonna slow down. Employers would be like, it's right after a recession, what are you talking about? There's plenty of people around. This is really, it's one of these things that is so slow moving and it's so easy to predict, and moving forward, there's not much that can change this picture. There can be changes in what employers' needs are, and there's kind of a big question mark out there with respect to automation. Just what will automation do? But right now, we're not in a place where we can turn all of our jobs over to machines. We're just not there yet with our machines. They're not smart enough yet. I hear they're going to be smart soon, but right now we're not there. And right now is when this big gap between employers' needs and the number of people we have available to work is opening up. You're like, you promised that you got more cheery later. Just wait for it. I mentioned that we see a pretty big drop-off in labor force participation in the later years. It's a really stable curve, guys. If you look at when people start retiring, it starts dropping off in the late 50s, and you have very, very few people by the 70s still working. Now, it's something that has increased over time. You can see that those lines have shifted outward on the right in the older years, that people are indeed staying in the workforce longer, maybe a year longer, maybe 2 years longer, but it hasn't completely changed. The picture doesn't completely change. Some people have in their minds, especially if they're older and they're working, they come up to me, no, you don't know. They say, I'm going to work until I am 87 and then I'm going to retire, whatever it is that they say. When you look at the population numbers, when you look at everyone in the state, it's a pretty stable pattern. So we can say with a great deal of certainty that these work patterns are likely they'll probably still continue, people will still continue to work a little bit longer in the future, but it's not going to be completely a different picture going forward. So I mentioned immigration and the contribution of immigration to growth. This is just what it looks like over time. The blue bars are showing you the number of people that we have gained as a result of international immigration. And you can see that those numbers in the 2000s have been much larger than they were in the 1990s. And you can see that there was a dip around the time of the recession, but that it's picked back up again, and that we have more people moving here from other countries. We're gaining more people from other countries than we were around the time of the recession. Another pattern that has been really stable for some time for Minnesota is that we've lost more people to other states than we've gained for many, many years in a row, except for, what? Look at 2017 up there. For the first time since 2001, we actually had an inflow of people to the state, a net inflow. We don't have the data yet to say exactly who, what, why, where. That's something that comes out in a few months, and we'll hopefully be able to learn something from that. But we do have a very strong economy here. We have very low unemployment. That's true across the U.S., but it's more true here in Minnesota. And so it's possible that what we're doing is we're pulling in more people from other states, particularly other Midwestern states that have been losing people. So the picture for the future, I don't know. I'm not very good at predicting stuff when it changes like that, guys. If you would have asked me 2 years ago, I'd have been like, well, it's been negative for 15 years. It's a pretty long trend. But this is really pretty hopeful that we're starting to see more people move in, because employers still need that, the growth that comes from in-migration. Oops. Thank you. I was like, they're not lining up. Okay. Right now, we have, and for the last year, we've had more job openings than we have had people looking for work. That's a really different picture than we've had any other time during this whole series, which begins in 2001. You can see around the course of the recession, we had all kinds of unemployed people. That blue line shoots up. The number of available jobs, job openings drops off. But right now, we're in this position where we have more job openings than we have folks to fill those jobs. This doesn't say anything about if they're located in the right place, if they have the right skills for the need of the employer. This is generally just to give you a picture of how tight this labor market is. And what we've seen, the most recent data point just came out this week. And what we have seen is that it's continuing to be a very, very tight labor market. And so if you are involved in hiring here, or if your job shifts, depending on the availability of workers, if it's a different job for you, depending on what kind of help you have, or what you pay workers, what you must pay workers in order to attract them. This is something that, from a demographic perspective, from when I look at the numbers, looks like it's here to stay for a while. Just given what our demographic trends are, I don't see a lot of growth in the future. If the economy continues to perform as it does, and that's an if, we're going to continue to see labor force shortages for some time. So when I talk to employers about this, sometimes they look really scared. Big eyes. If they're in hiring, they're like, oh no, it's not going to just clear itself up. This isn't going to resolve itself. When I talk to people who are just getting out of school, who maybe have had a hard time finding employment, not a different group, maybe the same group, I don't know. They look at these numbers and they think, oh, this looks pretty good. This could be okay. This means more opportunity for some people, particularly people who are just getting their start, particularly for people who have been marginalized or have other barriers to employment. Employers are beginning to look to do things differently because they understand that they're not getting the results from behaving in the same way that they always have. And when I say behaving, I mean posting a job opening and waiting for the resumes to come unto them, fully formed, you know. Instead, employers are starting to think, where do I find people younger? Where do I find people earlier? How do I train and grow my own workforce? How do I find ways to be flexible? How do I reduce barriers to employment that maybe I haven't had to think about in the past, whether it's the basic requirements, for example, in government work now, right? Are the basic requirements really what they need to be? Or have they been inflated over the years? That's something that sometimes we're thinking about now because we're in this new position where we're forced to think differently. And it's not bad for everyone. It certainly can be open up opportunities for a lot of people who haven't had them in the past. The jobs that are available right now, when we look at this very tight labor market, they are not evenly distributed across the wage spectrum. Many of the jobs that are available are at the lower wages. The green dot is showing you the median wage. You can see it on the right axis there. But you can see that many of the job openings are in healthcare, social assistance, accommodation and food service, retail trade. In particular, those three are the largest groups. And so I think it has implications for social service providers, of course, that you have this huge pool of opportunities for people against which you are competing. I want to end by talking about trends in diversity. Growing diversity is kind of that other side of growth, because when populations are growing, it is almost entirely due to increases in populations of color, due to increases in diversity, not just in racial diversity, but ethnic, cultural, linguistic, religious, all kinds of diversity. That is coupled with the growth that we see around the state and in pockets of the state. When we see growth, it's almost always a result of growing diversity or being driven by increasing diversity. Here in Washington County, about 17% of the county's residents are people of color. That means they would have gotten a census form and filled out that they were American Indian, Asian, African American, or Black, Hispanic, or Latino, or one or more of those things. And you can see that that increase has really taken off since 1990 in Hennepin and Ramsey County in particular, but for the suburban counties as well, you've seen that uptick since about 1990. And just to give you a sense of the racial composition today of Washington County, you can see it's still largely non-Hispanic white, as is the state overall. But there are increasing shares of Asian Americans, Black or African American, and Latino residents as well. Part of what is driving that increase, we looked at it earlier, is just an increase in international immigration. This is a slightly different view of that, but you can see that there has been an uptick in Minnesota, kind of a gentle uptick. It hasn't been a dramatic one, kind of a gentle uptick in the last 10 to 15 years in the number of foreign-born. Of course, if you look back further at our state's history, you can see that there are much higher levels of immigration in our state's past, close to 40% around 1890. But of course now immigrants are coming from all around the globe rather than just a few European countries. So it's a different story in some respects, but the level of immigration isn't unprecedented. Part of what's unique to Minnesota is that we have a larger than average share of immigrants that come here as refugees. And you can see that in the blue here, you see this wave of refugees coming from Southeast Asia in the 1970s and early 1980s. There was a wave of refugees who came from the former Soviet Union in the early 90s. And more recently, in the later 90s and into the 2000s, we've seen an increase in refugees coming from Africa, and again, from Asia more recently. This is just part of the history of who we are and who our foreign-born populations are here in Minnesota. We've had people who are pretty good at helping people settle. We've had faith-based communities and nonprofits since the 1970s who've said, okay, let's do this. Let's meet people at the airport. Let's help them find housing. Let's get their kids into the school system. Let's get them into a church if that's what they want to do. And when those social service agencies and when those faith-based organizations got that experience, it was something that just reinforced when subsequent waves of need around the globe opened up. And so now, if we look at the state overall, about 20% of our newer immigrants come here as refugees. That's for Minnesota. It's about half that for the US overall. We've been hearing that the refugee program is likely to be, the caps are being lowered in terms of the number of people who will be let into the US as refugees, and that's likely to have an impact here in Minnesota on our overall growth numbers. It's something that we haven't seen fully yet. We've seen a few months of that data kind of taper off, but we haven't really seen what the full impact will be yet. But it's another thing that we're watching. And if we look kind of going forward, will our diversity continue to grow? Will we continue to increase with respect to immigration because of immigration? We definitely know that we will become more diverse going forward, regardless of what happens with immigration. And that's because our parent population is getting more and more diverse as we age. So as we have more people of color, more people who are ethnically and culturally diverse in those parenthood ages, that's how we become more diverse as a state. And we know that that will continue into the future. There's some momentum to that. What's going to happen with immigration? I would have expected, given what's happening with our labor force growth, that we would see an increase in immigration. That's what we've seen in other European countries when labor force has begun to slow because of population aging. You've seen this uptick in immigration as kind of a result, a policy response. But that's not happening right now, right? That's not the conversation we're having right now. So for me, it's more of a question mark. Is this a pause in the flow of our immigrants here to Minnesota, or is this something that's going to have longer term impacts? That's a question that's still up in the air. The demand will be there. I have no question about that. But the question is, will the policies align with the demand that we have here in Minnesota? I just want to share some of the recent income numbers with you with respect to our diverse populations, because it continues to be the case that we have some of the largest disparities in economic and social outcomes here by race. We do very well in Minnesota if we look at us all as a whole, but we start looking at individual population groups and we start to see larger economic and social disparities arise. The good news is that we have seen growth in income across all groups in the state, across different racial and ethnic groups. You can see that little curve upward as we've come out of the recession. There's certainly big differences that remain, but we have indeed seen this improved economic picture, and this goes beyond just household income. It's true for employment. It's true for unemployment, that we've seen improved pictures and improved earnings as well. So I know it's a lot of numbers. There's a lot going on. Some of the stuff is really predictable. As I said, the aging trend is really predictable. Increased diversity, racial and cultural diversity is pretty predictable. There's likely to be big changes ahead, both in our social, the way that we organize our communities, and in terms of our government institutions, particularly as the baby boomers put pressure on our public budgets. But for me, I think it's a very hopeful time, and that is because we have an opportunity to put into place things that work better than what we've got going on right now. When we look at some of these disparity numbers by race, and it's not only a racial issue, but it's one way to look at it, you know, is this the best we can do? I don't think so. I think this gives us the opportunity to make fairer institutions and communities for more people, that we're moving into a period where we're going to have a lot of demographic change, where we're going to have a lot of social and likely issues with our public budgets isn't necessarily a bad thing. Oop, I escaped it before my census commercial. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to open it up to questions in a minute, but I just want to take a moment to talk briefly about the 2020 census. It's something that I'm already working on very much, and that I know some other people in our communities are already working on as well. The census, you all know, it produces data that we've been looking at today. It probably produces data that you all use when you're looking at your communities here in Washington County. But it is something that is actually in our Constitution, and it's the way that our forefathers envisioned that we would have equal representation. There's no other way to get fair and equal representation unless we know how many people are living here. And I know, like, people think, well, the government knows. I mean, maybe you all know this. But lots of times when I'm talking to people, they're like, you already know everything. You know where all the people live. We don't. We know generally. But we don't have people, you know, in the U.S., we don't have people register when they're moving like they do in some northern European countries. So the movement that happens between censuses, we can guess at from things like building permits. You know, some other administrative data we can get some information from. Maybe some people use utilities to get a sense of population. But really, we don't have it until we don't have the good count, we don't have a full count until we do a census every 10 years. In addition to political representation that the census gives us after redistricting, there's also all kinds of funding that follows the census count. And so I just want to give you, let me see if I included that here, yeah. In Minnesota, it's about $8 billion per year that we receive from the federal government on the basis of a census count. And those are in programs such as Medicaid, WIC, SNAP. Have you all heard of these programs before? These monies are distributed on the basis of our census count. We've got one chance to get it right in 2020. And then that number essentially stays with us for the next 10 years. And so there's been a lot of issues at the Census Bureau lately, but particularly funding issues. Funding has been slow to come. There's questions about how accurate this census will be, especially with the late addition of the citizenship question. I'm happy to talk about that if you all are interested. But there's a lot at stake here for our communities. And the question is, what are we going to do to make sure the count is complete for these data that we rely on for political representation, for funding, and for the data that we use to make decisions? Oh, here we go. Medicaid, highway planning and construction, SNAP, WIC, school lunch program. These are all the programs that use a census number for their formula. And at the state level, we've got the same thing. So LGA funding is based on a census count. It comes off of population estimates, but those are grounded to a census count. So I am working very hard, usually for most of the year. You know, I'm a social scientist, I'm a demographer, that's how I was trained. And now at the end of the decade, all of a sudden, I'm an outreach professional. I'm an engagement professional. I'm just learning how that goes because I understand how important these data are for the communities that you all work with, for the work that you do in terms of both the political representation and the funding that we receive. So I would encourage you to think about what you can do as a county to help promote a census count. I know that you have lots of connections, and I would encourage you to plan around how you can use those connections to make sure that people are ready for the census when it comes.